Sign it, Judge Harlan said, sliding the paper across the bench. Or walk out of here with nothing. Eliza Monroe looked down at that paper, her father's name on one line, Caleb Whitaker's on the other, and felt the entire room holding its breath, waiting for her to break. She was 26 years old. She had buried her father 3 weeks ago. And now, the most powerful man in Black Hollow County was standing 10 feet away, watching her with the patience of someone who had never once been told no. Her hand was shaking, but she did not pick up the pen. If you've ever watched someone refuse to fall when everything was pushing them down, subscribe to our channel. Follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Wyoming Territory, Black Hollow County, 1885. The courtroom smelled like wood smoke and old leather, and Eliza Monroe had not slept in 4 days. She sat in the front row of the gallery, with her hands folded in her lap, and her spine perfectly straight, because her father had told her once that the way you hold your body tells the room who you are before you ever open your mouth. Thomas Monroe had believed that. He had lived that. And now Thomas Monroe was in the ground behind the ranch he had spent 30 years bleeding for, and Eliza was here alone, and the room was full of men who had already decided how this was going to end. Judge Walter Harlan sat behind the bench with his reading glasses perched at the end of his nose and a stack of documents in front of him that Eliza had never seen before 3 days ago. He was 61 years old. He had been the circuit judge for Black Hollow County for 19 years. He had known Thomas Monroe personally. He had eaten at their table. He had shaken her father's hand at church every Sunday for as long as Eliza could remember. He had not looked at her once since she walked through the door. Caleb Whitaker sat across the aisle with 2 lawyers flanking him like bookends. He was wearing a dark wool suit that cost more than most families in the county earned in 6 months. His boots were polished. His hat was expensive. His posture communicated one thing clearly: he had already won, and he knew it, and he was only here as a formality. He was 44 years old. He owned 11,000 acres. He owned the grain mill, the lumber yard, 3 of the 4 cattle contracts with the railroad, and according to gossip that had been circulating for years, the judge's re-election campaign from 3 years back. Eliza had known Caleb Whitaker her whole life. She had never trusted him. Neither had her father. The matter before this court, Judge Harlan said, clearing his throat, concerns the outstanding debt recorded against the Monroe land grant dated March of 1883. The amount of $14,200 payable in full with interest compounded quarterly. Eliza's attorney, a young man named Percy Gaines, who had taken her case because he was the only one who would lean toward her and whispered, "Don't react." She didn't. But her jaw tightened. $14,000. Her father had never once mentioned a debt of that size. Not once. She had gone through every paper in his desk the night after he died. She had found the ranch ledgers, the cattle records, the tax receipts going back to 1871. She had found the deed. She had found his will, which left everything to her without complication. She had found a letter he had started writing to her and never finished, and she had held that letter for an hour before she could breathe again. She had not found a loan agreement for $14,000. "Your Honor," Percy said, rising to his feet. "We've requested documentation of the original lender for this alleged debt, and we have yet to receive." "The documentation has been provided to this court," Harlan said flatly. "The debt is valid." "The documentation was provided by Mr. Whitaker's attorneys 2 days ago. We haven't had sufficient time to—" "Mr. Gaines." Harlan looked over his glasses. "Are you suggesting this court acted improperly?" The room shifted. Eliza felt it, that collective flinch, that subtle realignment of every person present away from her and toward the safer shore. Percy sat down. Eliza looked at Caleb. He was watching her with an expression she recognized. She had seen it before on men who hunted that specific stillness right before they moved. Patient, certain, already calculating what they would do with what they were about to take. "The terms are straightforward," Harlan continued. Miss Monroe has 30 days to repay the full amount with interest, or the property reverts to the creditor as collateral under the terms of the original agreement. And who is the creditor? Percy asked carefully. Harlan paused. Whitaker Consolidated Holdings. There it was. Eliza heard someone in the gallery murmur. She heard a woman near the back say something quietly. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the judge and breathed in through her nose and reminded herself what her father had told her about the body and the room. Percy was on his feet again. Your Honor, this represents a clear conflict of interest. Mr. Whitaker is both the plaintiff and the creditor, which means Mr. Gaines. Which means this entire proceeding. Mr. Gaines, sit down, or I will hold you in contempt. Silence. Percy sat down. His hands were shaking slightly. He was 28 years old, and this was the largest case he had ever taken, and Eliza suddenly understood that she had not come here with a real attorney. She had come here with a man who believed in doing the right thing, which was not the same thing at all. Caleb Whitaker stood up. He didn't ask permission. He simply rose to his feet the way men do when they've decided that permission is for other people. Your Honor, he said, in the interest of resolving this matter with minimal disruption to the county, I'd like to make a proposal. Harlan nodded. Eliza went still. Miss Monroe is a young woman in a difficult situation, Caleb said. He had a voice like slow water smooth on the surface, moving fast underneath. She's recently lost her father. She has limited resources and no male family to assist her. The ranch is a valuable property, and it would be a shame to see it fall into disrepair through foreclosure. He paused. Let that word foreclosure sit in the air like smoke. I'm prepared to cancel the debt entirely, he continued, to allow Miss Monroe to remain on the property with full access to the house and a reasonable living stipend. In exchange, he turned and looked directly at Eliza for the first time. She would become my wife. The room erupted. Not loudly, not dramatically. It erupted the way rooms do in small towns where everyone knows everyone. In 100 small sounds whispers the creak of benchwood, the sharp intake of breath from the woman near the back who had murmured earlier. Eliza did not move. She looked at Caleb Whitaker, and she thought with a clarity that surprised even herself. He planned this. He planned all of it. The debt, the timeline, this moment. Caleb was still looking at her. His expression was not unkind. That was the most disturbing part. He genuinely believed he was offering her something reasonable. You don't want a wife, Eliza said. Her voice was quiet. The room heard every word. Caleb tilted his head slightly. I beg your pardon. You want the ranch? She kept her eyes on him. The Whitaker land goes from the northern ridge to Miller Creek, but it doesn't connect to the railroad spur. My father's land does. You've wanted that connection for 10 years. My father told you no every time you asked. He told you no the last time 3 months before he died. Something moved across Caleb's face. Not embarrassment, not anger, something colder than either. Eliza, Percy said under his breath. So you want the ranch, she said, and you want a legal mechanism to take it. Call the thing what it is. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, call it whatever makes you comfortable. No. Miss Monroe. No. She said it again louder, clear, final. The room went very still. Judge Harlan set down his pen. Miss Monroe, I would encourage you to consider. With respect, Your Honor, you have a conflict of interest in this proceeding that would be visible to anyone willing to look. She stood. I will find the money. I have 30 days. I will find it. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. You have no resources, he said quietly. No family. No bank in this county will lend to you. I can promise you that. You're a young woman alone, and the world is not built to help young women alone. Then I'll build something different. She walked out of this courthouse. The air outside hit her like cold water, and she stood on the steps for a moment with her eyes closed and her hands gripped together because she had no idea how she was going to do what she had just said she would do. $14,000 in 30 days. With no bank willing to lend her a cent if Caleb Whitaker was true to his word, and she had no doubt he was. Percy came out behind her. "Eliza, you were extraordinary in there, but I need you to understand what we're facing. He has the judge. He has the banks. He controls the cattle contracts, which means your neighbors can't help you without risking their own income. We need to find out where that loan document came from," Eliza said. Percy blinked. "What? My father did not borrow $14,000 from Caleb Whitaker." She turned to look at him. "I know my father. I went through every paper he owned. There is no loan, which means someone created that document." "Eliza, that's an extraordinary—" "I know what it is, but it's true." She started down the steps. "I need to talk to my father's accountant, and I need to find someone who can read a legal document and tell me what's been changed." Percy hurried to keep up. "Who do you have in mind?" "I don't know yet." "Then where are you going?" "Home." She kept walking. To think. She rode back to the ranch as the sun dropped toward the ridge, and with every mile she tried to do the math she already knew wouldn't work. The cattle would sell for maybe $2,000 if she got lucky with the market. The equipment was old. There was nothing else liquid. Even if she borrowed against everything movable, she would come up short by $10,000 and more. The ranch looked different when she arrived than it had looked that morning. Not physically different. Every board was where it had been. Her father's boots were still on the porch where he'd left them. The old windmill was turning in the evening breeze the way it always had. But something had shifted in the way she saw it. Like looking at a photograph of a place you've already left. She sat on the porch steps for a long time. Then she heard hooves on the road, a single horse, moving at a steady walk, not hurried. She watched the road until the rider appeared out of the long shadow of the ridge coming from the direction of Casper. Tall in the saddle, a worn brown coat, a hat that had seen considerable weather. He stopped at the gate. For a moment they looked at each other across the distance. "Miss Monroe," he said. "Depends who's asking." "Name's Jack Dawson." He kept his hands visible on the reins. She noted that and appreciated it. "I worked a season for your father about 6 years back. Cattle drive spring of '79. He was a good man." "He was." She studied him. "What do you want, Mr. Dawson?" "I heard about what happened today." He glanced toward the courthouse direction. "Word travels." "It always does in small counties." She waited. "I've been in Black Hollow for about a week," Jack said, "looking for work. And I heard some things about Caleb Whitaker before I got here." He paused. "Things worth knowing, maybe if you're trying to fight him." Eliza stood up slowly. "Are you offering to help me?" "I'm offering to tell you what I know, and let you decide what to do with it." He didn't move toward her. "I'm not here to take charge of anything that isn't mine to take charge of." She walked to the gate and looked up at him. He was maybe 35, the kind of face that had been through weather and kept its structure. He had the eyes of a man who had seen some serious trouble in his time and come out the other side of it quieter. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." They sat at her father's kitchen table, and Jack told her what he knew. He had passed through a town called Ridgeline 6 months ago, 3 counties north. There had been a similar situation there, a widow named Clara Marsh, who had owned prime grazing land on a river bend. A debt appeared after her husband died. A document no one had seen before. A judge who seemed to already know the outcome before the proceedings started. Whitaker Consolidated Holdings had gotten that land. Clara Marsh was living in a boarding house in Casper now, with nothing left. Eliza listened without interrupting. When Jack finished, she said, "How many times has he done this?" "From what I can piece together, at least 3 that I know of. Probably more." "And no one has stopped him." He's careful, Jack said. He picks people who are already vulnerable, recently widowed, no family nearby. He waits until they're at their lowest point and then he moves fast before they can find their footing. He planned my father's death into this. The words tasted like iron. He knew my father was sick. He knew it would leave me alone. That's what I believe, yes. Can you prove it? Jack was quiet for a moment. Not yet. But you think it can be proven. I think the documents he's using are false. And I think if you could get someone to compare them to your father's actual records, handwriting paper ink, you could demonstrate that. Eliza looked at him. Why are you doing this? Jack wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Something happened to someone I cared about. A long time ago. Same kind of situation, different state. I didn't help when I should have. I've been carrying that a while. She held his gaze. I'm not a charity case, Mr. Dawson. No, he said. You're not. If you stay and help, it's because you're working. I can't pay much right now, but I'll pay what I can, and I'll pay the rest when this is over. I'm not asking what you need. She met his eyes directly. I'm telling you the terms. I don't take things I haven't earned, and I don't accept help I haven't contracted for. If you work, you get paid. That's the way I do it. Jack looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. All right, he said. Those are fair terms. Good. She stood and took both cups to the basin. You can use the bunkhouse. My father kept it in good condition. Yes, ma'am. And Mr. Dawson. She turned. I need you to understand something before we start. I'm not trying to survive this. I'm trying to win it. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. There is. What neither of them knew, sitting in that kitchen with the oil lamp burning low and the prairie dark outside, was that Caleb Whitaker had already taken his next step. 3 hours after the courthouse proceeding, he had sent writers to every bank in the county with a simple message. Any institution extending credit to Eliza Monroe would find its relationship with Whitaker Consolidated Holdings reconsidered. He had spoken personally to the sheriff, a man named Orville Cates, who owed his last election to Whitaker money. And he had dispatched one of his men, a quiet, cold-eyed individual named Rourke, to keep watch on the Monroe property and report any unusual activity. Caleb Whitaker had been doing this for 15 years. He was very good at it. And he had never once been stopped by anyone. The first sign that something was shifting came 3 days later. Jack had spent those 3 days going through every document Eliza owned, every ledger, every receipt, every letter her father had kept. He had a methodical mind, the kind that moves slowly and misses nothing, and he came to Eliza on the evening of the third day with a specific page from the ranch ledger from March of 1883. This is the month the debt was supposedly created, he said, laying the ledger open on the table. Eliza leaned in. Your father recorded every transaction, down to $1.50 for fence wire. Jack ran his finger down the column. In March of '83, he recorded a sale of 40 head to Beckford Station. He recorded a payment to the Casper Mill. He recorded repair materials for the East Pasture fence. He looked up. He did not record receiving $14,000. Of course he didn't, Eliza said. Because he didn't. But here's the thing. Jack turned to a different page. If someone forged a loan agreement, they would have needed to use your father's signature. And they would have needed paper from the right time period and ink that aged correctly. He paused. Getting those things right is not easy. People who do it cheaply make mistakes. Eliza looked at him. Do you know someone who can identify those mistakes? There's a man in Cheyenne. His name is August Holloway. He worked for the Federal Land Office for 20 years. He's retired now, but he knows documents. Jack met her eyes. If we can get him the original papers, the ones filed with the court, and the original ledgers, he might be able to tell us what was changed and when. Can we get access to the court documents? Percy can request a copy as part of his case preparation. It's legal. Harlan can't deny it without making it obvious he's hiding something. Eliza thought for a moment. All right. Get Percy to request the copies tomorrow morning. She paused. And Jack, don't let anyone know you're going to Cheyenne. He looked at her steadily. You think we're being watched? I think Caleb Whitaker has spent 15 years perfecting this. He doesn't miss things. She picked up the ledger. Neither will we. It was Percy who told her about Mrs. Clara Marsh. He had done his own digging after their conversation outside the courthouse, driven by a combination of outrage and the slowly dawning understanding that he was inside something much larger than a simple debt dispute. He came to the ranch on the 5th day and sat across from Eliza with a look on his face that was equal parts horror and determination. Ridgeline, 2 years ago. Before that, a man named Henry Sutton in Fremont County. He died under circumstances that were called natural, but were disputed by his family. Before that, a woman in Carbon County. Percy spread his notes on the table. Every time there's a document that appears after the death. Every time the document is filed with a local judge who has received campaign contributions from Whitaker-affiliated sources. Every time the person being displaced is alone and has no powerful advocates. Eliza looked at the notes. He's a machine, she said quietly. He's a very efficient machine, Percy agreed. And Eliza, he's not going to stop. Not because you said no. He'll just increase the pressure until I break or run. She looked up. Which I'm not going to do. I know. Percy held her gaze. But I need you to understand what saying that means. This is not a man who accepts no. He's going to come at you from every angle. Your cattle, your water rights, your workers. Has he already moved on the workers? Percy hesitated. Percy. 2 of your ranch hands were approached yesterday, he said. Offered jobs on Whitaker land at twice the pay. Eliza sat back. Her father had employed 4 men full-time and 2 seasonal. If he picked them off one by one, the ranch would be impossible to run. Cattle needed hands. Winter was 8 weeks away. Who approached them? A man named Rourke. He works directly for Whitaker. She stood up and went to the door. Henry! Tom! She raised her voice. 2 of her ranch hands appeared from the direction of the barn. She looked at them directly. I heard about the offer, she said. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You have families, you need income. If the Whitaker pay is something you need, I understand it. She paused. But I want you to know what this is. Caleb Whitaker is trying to pick apart this ranch piece by piece so that I have no choice but to give in. Taking you would be part of that plan. That's the truth of it. What you decide is yours to decide. Henry, a quiet man in his 40s, who had worked for her father for 11 years, looked at her for a long moment. Your father once got me out of a situation I couldn't get myself out of, he said. I'm not going anywhere. Tom, 23 years old and new to the job, looked at the ground, then at Eliza. I didn't take the offer. She nodded. Thank you. She went back inside and sat at the table and for the first time allowed herself to feel how tired she was. Not just the physical tiredness of not sleeping properly for a week. The deeper kind. The kind that comes from holding something heavy for too long with no one to help you hold it. Jack came in from outside and looked at her. They stayed, she said. I know. He sat down across from her. Eliza, I'm fine. You don't have to be fine all the time. She looked at him sharply. Then the sharpness softened because he wasn't offering pity. He was just stating a fact. What I am, she said carefully, is angry. I am so angry I can barely see straight. My father spent 30 years on this land. He helped everyone around him. He gave people jobs when they needed work and credit when they needed food and time when they needed a neighbor. He was a good man. Her voice stayed steady, but her hands tightened on the table. And Caleb Whitaker looked at everything my father built and saw something he could take. That's all he saw. All that work, all that decency, and someone just decided to take it. Jack said nothing for a moment. Then we make sure he doesn't, he said. She met his eyes. We make sure he doesn't. she agreed. On the evening of this 9th day, Jack left quietly for Cheyenne with the court documents Percy had obtained and her father's original ledgers wrapped in oilcloth and packed in his saddlebag. He told no one except Eliza. He rode at night for the first 2 hours, and then took the long route through the northern pass, adding half a day to the journey, but avoiding the main road where Whitaker's men might be watching. Eliza watched him go from the porch and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, the particular loneliness of having trusted someone and sent them away. She shook it off. She had work to do. On the 12th day, the water stopped. The Monroe property drew from a stream that ran through the northeast corner fed by snowmelt off the ridge. The water rights had been part of her father's original land grant. They were legal, recorded, and unambiguous. But when Henry rode out to check the northern pasture, he found that the stream had been diverted. Someone had built a small dam upstream on land that abutted the Monroe property at a corner where the boundary was technically disputed in old survey records. And the water that should have been flowing south into Monroe grazing land was now going east into Whitaker territory. Henry came back and told Eliza, and she stood in the yard for a moment with the news sitting on her chest like a stone. Then she put on her coat and went to the survey office in Black Hollow. The clerk, a young woman named Agnes who had gone to school with Eliza and who looked at her with a complicated expression when she walked in, pulled the original survey maps at Eliza's request. Eliza spent 3 hours in that office. When she came out, she had 3 things: a copy of the original water rights grant, a note of the specific boundary coordinates that made Whitaker's dam illegal, and a deep fury that had clarified itself in those 3 hours into something cold and precise. She went directly to Sheriff Orville Cates. Cates was a large man who carried his discomfort with her in the way he looked slightly to her left when they talked, as if meeting her eyes directly required more courage than he currently possessed. "The dam is illegal," Eliza said, laying the survey copy on his desk. "These are the boundary coordinates. The diversion is on Monroe property rights. I need it removed." Cates looked at the paper. "I'll need to verify. Those are the original territorial survey coordinates. They're registered with the Federal Land Office." She kept her voice flat. "This is not a gray area, Sheriff. If you don't act on this, I will write to the federal marshal in Cheyenne and report a failure to enforce property rights." Cates looked at his desk. Eliza waited. Finally, he said, "I'll send a deputy to look at it." "When?" A pause. "Tomorrow." "Today," Eliza said. "The cattle need water." She waited in his office for 20 minutes until he sent the deputy. Then she rode back to the ranch and sat on the porch steps and waited to see what Caleb Whitaker's next move would be. She didn't have to wait long. At sundown, a rider came from the Whitaker property. Not Rourke. This was a younger man she didn't recognize who handed her an envelope without speaking and then turned and rode back the way he came. Inside the envelope was a single card, thick cream stock with Whitaker's name embossed in the upper left corner. "Miss Monroe, I understand you visited the survey office today. I understand you've also been gathering certain old documents. And I've heard you have a former ranch hand making inquiries in your behalf. You are a remarkable woman. Your father would be proud. But remarkable women, in my experience, eventually recognize the limits of remarkable. I have extended my offer once. I will extend it once more. The terms remain the same. After this, I will not ask again." She folded the card and set it on the table. Then she took out a sheet of paper and wrote her reply. It was 3 words. "My answer stands." She sealed it and gave it to Henry to deliver first thing in the morning. Then she sat at her father's desk and looked at the photograph on the wall. Thomas Monroe, in his early 40s, standing in front of the barn he'd built himself squinting into the sun, and she said quietly to no one in the room, "I'm still here, Papa." The oil lamp flickered in a draft from the window. Outside, the Wyoming night was cold and completely dark, and full of things that hadn't happened yet. She did not know that Jack Dawson was riding hard toward Black Hollow with something in his saddlebag that was about to change everything. She did not know that Caleb Whitaker had already made a decision of his own. and she did not know that in 11 days this would come to a head in a way that would force everyone in Black Hollow County to finally choose a side. But she was still standing, and that for now was enough. Jack Dawson rode back into Monroe Ranch on the 14th day, 2 days earlier than Eliza expected, and the look on his face when he dismounted told her everything before he said a single word. Not bad news. Something else. The look of a man who has found the thread he was pulling and followed it somewhere dark. Eliza came off the porch and met him in the yard. What did Holloway say? Jack didn't answer immediately. He tied his horse, took off his hat, and turned to face her in the cold morning light. The loan document is a forgery, he said. August Holloway is certain of it. The paper stock dates correctly to 1883, but the ink composition is wrong. The iron gall content is inconsistent with ink available in that region before 1886. Someone used newer ink on old paper. Eliza felt the air leave her lungs. Not from shock, from confirmation. There is a particular feeling that comes when you have believed something for 2 weeks that no one else believed, and then someone with authority and knowledge looks at the evidence and says, "Yes, you were right." It is not triumphant. It is heavy. "He's willing to testify?" she asked. "He is, but Eliza—" Jack stopped. "There's more." She waited. Holloway knows this technique. He's seen it before. Not from Whitaker directly, but from a man who has worked for Whitaker for at least 7 years. A man who used to work for the Territorial Land Office before he was dismissed for falsifying survey boundaries in Carbon County. He looked at her steadily. "His name is Leonard Greer. He lives in Black Hollow. He works at the county clerk's office." The county clerk's office, where every deed, every survey record, every legal document in Black Hollow County passed through on its way to becoming official. "He's been inside the system the whole time," Eliza said. "For years. Holloway believes he forged at least 5 documents that were used in similar cases. He kept copies. He kept them as insurance, Holloway thinks, in case Whitaker ever decided he was a liability." "Where are the copies?" Holloway doesn't know exactly, but he believes Greer keeps them somewhere accessible. Close. Somewhere he can reach them quickly if he needs to run. Eliza's mind moved fast. "If we could get those copies—" "It would be over," Jack said. "Not just for you. For all of it. Every piece of land Whitaker has taken through this method. Every forged document. It would unravel the whole operation." She looked at him. "Can we get to Greer before Whitaker realizes what you found?" "That depends on how fast we move." He held her gaze, and on whether Greer is the kind of man who's more afraid of Whitaker or more afraid of a federal prison sentence. Eliza was already thinking. "Percy needs to know tonight. Can you ride to town?" "I just rode from Cheyenne." "I know." She met his eyes. "Can you ride to town?" A long pause. Then, "Yes." "Go. I'll have Henry saddle a fresh horse. Don't tell Percy everything yet, just enough to get him to request a formal interview with the county clerk under the pretext of verifying document registration procedures. Make it sound routine. If Whitaker has someone watching Percy's office, we don't want them to know what we're actually looking for." Jack looked at her with an expression she was becoming familiar with, that subtle recalibration, like a man who keeps expecting a certain type of person and keeps finding someone different. "All right," he said. "And Jack." She stopped him. "Thank you." He nodded once, put his hat back on, and went to find Henry. Eliza stood in the yard alone for a moment. 14 days down, 16 to go. And now they had something. She went inside and started writing. She wrote 3 letters that afternoon, one to the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne, one to the Territorial Marshal's office, and one to a newspaper editor in Casper named William Fent, who had a reputation for printing things that powerful people preferred unprinted. She did not send them yet. She needed more before she could move publicly. But she dated them and sealed them and put them in the drawer of her father's desk, ready to go. The ranch needed feeding. She fed it. There was nothing romantic about what the next few hours looked like, she and Henry moving through the work of keeping cattle alive, checking fences, filling water troughs from the stream that had been restored 2 days ago by a deputy who had done it with the slow reluctance of a man following orders he didn't like. She did the work with her hands and her back, and her mind kept moving the whole time, turning the problem like a stone, looking for its weak side. The weak side was Greer. A man who falsified documents for money was not a loyal man. He was a practical man, and practical men, when they understood the shape of what was coming, made practical decisions about which side of it they wanted to be on. By evening, Percy sent a message back with one of the Whitaker ranch hands, who didn't know what he was carrying. Interview with clerk arranged for tomorrow at 10. Come to my office first. Eliza read the message twice. Then she burned it in the stove. She did not sleep much that night. She lay in her father's house and listened to the wind off the ridge and thought about Leonard Greer, sitting in the county clerk's office with his copies, and wondered whether he knew yet that the ground under him was beginning to shift. She thought about Caleb Whitaker, who had not responded to her 3-word note. His silence was more unnerving than anything he could have said. Men who were used to being answered eventually did something when they were ignored. She thought about Jack sleeping in the bunkhouse, who had ridden to Cheyenne and back, and then ridden to town, and who had never once asked her to slow down or make it easier. She thought about her father, and the photograph on the wall, and the letter he had started and never finished, and she pressed that grief down to where it lived now, not gone, never gone, but held so it didn't spill. She got up before dawn and made coffee, and was already at the table with the ledgers when Jack knocked on the kitchen door at 5:30. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept enough." She pushed a cup toward him. "What did Percy say when you saw him?" He was shaken. Jack sat down. "He didn't fully believe the forgery until I told him about Holloway. When it landed, you could see it hit him. He sat there for a moment, and then he said, 'I've been filing motions in a courtroom that was already sold.' He looked like a man who'd just discovered the house he built was sitting on sand." "Is he still with us?" "He's angry," Jack said. "Angry people stay. Good." She turned the ledger page. "I need you at the interview this morning, but stay outside. Percy handles Greer directly. If Greer sees too many faces, he'll close up. And if he closes up, then we find another way." She looked up. "But I don't think he will." "Why not?" "Because he kept copies," she said simply. "A man keeps insurance when he's afraid of the person he works for. If he was afraid enough to keep the copies, he's afraid enough to consider the alternative." Jack looked at her over his coffee. "You understand people." "My father taught me to." She looked at the photograph. "He said you can disagree with a man's choices and still understand exactly why he made them. He said that was the only way to predict what someone will do next." Smart man. The smartest I ever knew. She stood and took her cup to the basin. "Let's get ready." The morning moved fast after that. Percy's office was on the second floor above the dry goods store. A narrow room with too many papers and not enough shelves, which had always struck Eliza as exactly right for the kind of law Percy practiced. He was waiting for them when she arrived, standing rather than sitting, his coat already on. "He knows something's happening," Percy said without preamble. "I could hear it in how he answered when I sent the request yesterday. Too quick to agree. Too cooperative." "He's calculating," Eliza said. "That's fine. Let him calculate. He'll reach the same conclusion I did." "Which is?" "That Whitaker is the bigger threat." Percy looked uncertain. "What if he goes to Whitaker first, warns him? Then we accelerate," she said. "But I don't think he will. Going to Whitaker means admitting he felt threatened enough to go. That tells Whitaker he knows something Whitaker might want him not to know. He'd be signing his own end." She paused. "Greer is smart enough to understand that. He survived 7 years in that office by understanding which way the wind is blowing." Percy blew out a breath. "All right." He looked at Jack. "You're staying out." "Outside," Jack said. "In sight of the door." "Why in sight of the door?" Jack was quiet for a moment. "In case someone else comes through it." Percy absorbed that. Then he nodded, picked up his case, and they went to the county clerk's office. Leonard Greer was 52 years old, thin, in the way that suggested he had always been thin, with sharp eyes behind wire-framed glasses, and the careful stillness of a man who had spent a long time practicing how to look like he had nothing to hide. He met Percy in the front room of the clerk's office and shook his hand and offered him a chair and brought out the documents Percy had requested for his cover inquiry. Standard registration records from the past 2 years, and everything about him was smooth and correct, and just slightly too smooth and correct. Percy made small talk for 3 minutes. Eliza had told him to do exactly that. 3 minutes let Greer settle into believing this was routine, then move. "Mr. Greer," Percy said, opening his case, "I'd also like to ask you about a document registered in March of 1883. A loan agreement between Thomas Monroe and Whitaker Consolidated Holdings." Greer's expression didn't change, but his left hand resting on the desk went very still. "I'd need to look that up," he said. "Of course." Percy placed August Holloway's written analysis on the desk between them. "While you're looking, I'd also like you to read this." Greer looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at it the way you look at something you've been dreading and then recognize. Then he picked it up. Percy waited. He told Eliza afterward that those 40 seconds while Greer read the analysis were the longest 40 seconds of his professional life. Finally, Greer set the paper down. "Who is August Holloway?" he said. "Former chief examiner for the Federal Territorial Land Office. 20 years of service. Expert in document authentication." Percy kept his voice level. "He's willing to testify." Greer took off his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth from his pocket. A small, methodical gesture. Buying time. "Mr. Gaines," he said, "I think you may be operating under a misunderstanding about—" "Mr. Greer." Percy leaned forward. "I'm not here on behalf of any court. I'm not here representing the sheriff or the marshal's office. I'm here as the private attorney for Eliza Monroe, and this conversation is right now informal." He paused. "I would like it to stay informal." Greer went still. "There is a window," Percy continued, "a short window in which someone who has information about how certain documents were created might be able to provide that information to the appropriate federal authorities, and in doing so, demonstrate meaningful cooperation. That window closes the moment any of this becomes official. Once it's official, the options change considerably." Silence. Greer looked at the wall, at his desk, at some middle distance that wasn't quite the room. "I have a daughter," he said finally, very quietly. "In Denver. She's 12. "I know," Percy said, just as quietly. "That's why the window is still open." Another long silence. When Greer spoke again, his voice was different, flatter. The smoothness gone out of it. "There's a locked case," he said. "In the surveyor's storage room, 3rd building down from the courthouse, the one with the green door. There's a case under the floor panel in the northeast corner. I have the key." He reached into his desk drawer slowly and visibly and set a small brass key on the desk between them. 7 documents. All of them carry Whitaker's instruction to me in his own hand. Letters. Dated. Specific. Percy stared at the key. "I'll need a few days," Greer said, "to arrange some things. My daughter." "You have 48 hours," Percy said. "After that, I cannot control what happens." Greer nodded. Once. Small, like a man agreeing to something that has been approaching him for a long time. Percy picked up the key and left. Eliza was waiting half a block down the street, and when Percy reached her and opened his hand to show her the key, she looked at it for a long moment and then looked up at him. "He's going to give us the letters," Percy said, "in writing, in Whitaker's own hand." Eliza closed her eyes for 1 second, just one. Then she opened them and said, "We need to move tonight." They moved that night. Jack went to the green-doored building after dark, found the floor panel exactly where Greer described, and came back 40 minutes later with a flat leather case under his arm. He set it on the kitchen table, and the 3 of them opened it together. 7 documents. 7 letters in Caleb Whitaker's distinctive slanting handwriting, each one addressed to Greer, each one specific and damning. dates, instructions, dollar amounts, names. The Monroe loan forgery was the fifth. Before it were four others, including one that referenced Henry Sutton of Fremont County, and a line that made Percy inhale sharply and set the letter down. He knew Sutton was going to die, Percy said. He writes about it in past tense, but the date on the letter is 2 weeks before Sutton's death. The room was very quiet. Jack stood at the end of the table, with his arms folded, looking at the letters, and his jaw was set in a way Eliza had learned to recognize as the external expression of a particular kind of internal controlled fury. He didn't just steal land, Jack said. He arranged for people to lose their lives and then moved in while their families were still grieving. Yes, Eliza said. And everyone in this county let him. They were afraid, or they benefited, or they didn't know. She looked at the letters. They'll know now. Percy was already thinking through the legal architecture. We need to get these to the federal marshal before Whitaker realizes what Greer gave us. If he finds out before we can file— He won't, Eliza said. How can you be certain? She looked at him. Because Greer isn't going to tell him. Greer is packing a bag right now and getting his daughter out of Denver. She paused. And because we're going to move so fast that even if Whitaker hears something tonight, it won't be fast enough. Percy stared at her. You want to go to Cheyenne tonight? I want you to go to Cheyenne tonight, she said. With Holloway's analysis and these letters and a written statement from me. I want you to put them in the hands of the federal marshal before 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. That's— Percy looked at the window at the dark outside. That's a 12-hour ride. Yes. He absorbed that. I'll need copies of the letters in case something happens to the originals, he said. Jack will copy them now. He writes clearly. She looked at Jack. Jack was already reaching for paper. Percy watched him for a moment, then looked at Eliza. You know what happens after I file these? Yes. Whitaker won't be able to come after you legally anymore, but that doesn't mean— Percy. She met his eyes directly. I know what kind of man Caleb Whitaker is. I've known it my whole life. I know what he's capable of when he's cornered. She held his gaze. But he has never once been cornered before, and I think cornered men make mistakes. Percy left at midnight with the originals in his case and copies sealed in a separate pouch. Eliza and Jack stayed at the kitchen table until the sound of his horse faded into the dark. Then they were alone in the house with the copies and the lamp and the settled gravity of what they had just done. Jack poured them each a small measure of the whiskey her father had kept in the cabinet above the stove. He set hers in front of her and sat down across the table. You've been running on no sleep and pure stubbornness for 2 weeks, he said. Seems to be working. Barely. He looked at her. When did you last eat a proper meal? She thought about it. Yesterday morning. Eliza. I know. She picked up the whiskey. I'll eat tomorrow. Tonight I need to think. What else is there to think about? Percy has the evidence. Holloway will testify. Greer is— Whitaker, she said. Jack went quiet. What happens in the next 48 hours before Percy can file, and it becomes public, that's when Whitaker is most dangerous. She looked at the copies on the table. He's going to hear something. He has people everywhere. Someone will notice Greer acted strangely. Someone will see a light on in the surveyor's building last night. Something. She turned the whiskey glass in her hands. He's going to move before we expect him to, and when he moves, it's going to come straight at this ranch. Jack was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. What do we do? She looked at him across the table. In the lamplight, she could see the tiredness in him that he didn't let into his voice or his posture. The kind of tiredness that is separate from being tired, the kind that comes from carrying something alone for years. She had been watching it in him since the first night. It was diminishing. Not gone, but less. We get the workers positioned, she said. Henry and Tom on the north and south approaches where they can see anyone coming before they reach the house. We put everything valuable, the copies, the ledger somewhere Whitaker's men can't find in a quick search. She paused. And we sleep in shifts. Jack nodded. "I'll take the first watch," he said. "We'll split it." She stood, picked up her cup. 3 hours each. You first, I'll relieve you at 3. He started to argue and then stopped himself, which she appreciated. She was too tired to argue about whether she was capable of keeping watch on her own property. She went to her father's room and lay down fully clothed and closed her eyes. She thought she wouldn't sleep. She was wrong. She went under fast and hard, the sleep of someone who has been holding something too heavy for too long and finally allows themselves to set it down for a few hours. She didn't dream. When Jack woke her at 3, tapping twice on the doorframe, she was on her feet in seconds. "Quiet," he said. "Nothing moving. Go sleep." He nodded and was already gone. Eliza sat in her father's chair by the front window with a blanket around her shoulders and the darkness of the Wyoming plains spread out in front of her. She sat with everything that had happened in the past 2 weeks, and she thought about her father, and she thought about Clara Marsh in a boarding house in Casper, and she thought about Henry Sutton, who had died in circumstances that were disputed and would now be revisited, and she thought about all the small moments of ordinary life that Caleb Whitaker had destroyed so that he could own 1 more acre of land and control 1 more road and collect 1 more dollar. She thought about what came next and what it was going to cost. And then she heard it. A sound from the road. Not a horse. Several horses. Moving fast, without lights. She was on her feet before she finished processing the sound, and she crossed the room in 4 steps and put her hand on Jack's bunkhouse door and knocked once hard. Jack, he was awake instantly. She heard it in the quality of his silence, the silence of a man who wasn't sleeping deeply, who was already half out of it when she knocked. "Riders," she said through the door. "North Road, at least 4. The door opened. He was dressed and holding his rifle. They looked at each other in the dark. "Henry," he said, "already going." She was moving toward the barn. "Get to the porch. Don't shoot first. Let them make the first move." "Eliza, let them make the first move," she said again. "I need it on record that they came to us." She didn't wait to hear what he said to that. She ran. The riders came in hard and fast, and they didn't bother with the gate. Eliza heard the fence rail crack as the first horse pushed through it, and that sound, the sound of something her father had built being broken, without a second thought, landed in her chest, like a stone dropped in still water. 4 riders. Then a 5th coming up behind. And behind them a wagon with 2 men on the bench moving slower but coming steady. She reached Henry at the barn door in the dark and grabbed his arm. "How many can you see?" 5 mounted, 2 on the wagon. His voice was steady. Henry had that quality, an absolute steadiness under pressure, that she had always admired and never fully understood, until now, standing in the dark with her heart going hard in her chest, grateful for it. Rourke's in front. Rourke, Whitaker's man, the quiet, cold-eyed one. "Tom," she said. "South pasture. He'll have heard them come in." "Get him back here. I need everyone where I can see them." Henry went. Eliza walked back toward the house and stepped up onto the porch beside Jack, who was standing with his rifle held low, and his eyes on the riders pulling up in the yard. Rourke stopped his horse 20 feet from the porch steps. He was not a large man, but he had the particular quality of men who have done violence calmly, something in how he occupied space, how he held still. He looked at Eliza, and then at Jack, and then back at Eliza, and his expression carried the specific blankness of someone who has separated themselves from caring about what they are about to do. "Miss Monroe," he said. "Mr. Whitaker sends his regards." "It's 3 in the morning," Eliza said. "Tell Mr. Whitaker his timing needs work." Something moved in Rourke's face. Not quite amusement, more like acknowledgement. He's had word that certain property belonging to the county record office may have been improperly accessed tonight. He's concerned about the integrity of official documents. "Then he should speak to the sheriff," Eliza said. "In the morning, during business hours." "He's also concerned," Rourke continued, as if she hadn't spoken, "that Miss Monroe may be in possession of materials that don't belong to her. He'd like to resolve that quietly. Jack shifted his weight slightly beside her. She felt it without looking at him. "You came onto my property in the middle of the night with 5 armed men and a wagon," Eliza said. "There is nothing quiet about that." "We can make this simple," Rourke said. "Give us what you took from the storage building, and this ends tonight with no further trouble." "I don't know what you're referring to," Eliza said, "and I'd like you and your men off my land." Rourke looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Monroe." His voice dropped not to a whisper, but to something deliberate. "I've done this before. I've sat in front of people who thought holding on was the right choice. It never was. Give us what we came for, and you keep your ranch, you keep your cattle, you keep everyone on this property safe." He let that last word sit for a moment. "That's a real offer." The yard was very quiet. Then Henry stepped out of the dark on Rourke's left, and Tom appeared from the right, and both of them were holding rifles, and the arithmetic of the yard shifted. Rourke looked left, then right. His horse moved slightly under him, and he steadied it. "You brought ranch hands to a negotiation," he said. "You brought 5 armed men to a conversation," Eliza replied. "I'd say we're even." A long beat. Rourke's men were exchanging glances now, the small, quick eye contact of people recalculating. "Last chance," Rourke said. His voice had gone flat. The negotiation tone was gone. "Get off my land," Eliza said, "or I start recording names and the federal marshal hears about armed trespass and intimidation of a private citizen, in addition to everything else he's going to hear about in approximately—" She glanced at the sky at the angle of the stars. 5 hours. Rourke stared at her. The federal marshal. She had said it plainly, deliberately, and she watched the phrase land on him like a change in temperature. He hadn't known. Whatever Whitaker had told him tonight, it hadn't included the fact that Percy Gaines was already writing for Cheyenne with 7 original letters in Caleb Whitaker's own handwriting. She watched him do the math. "We're leaving," Rourke said quietly. He turned his horse. The other riders followed. The wagon turned in a wide arc and went back through the broken gate. Eliza stood on the porch and watched every last one of them go, and she did not move until the sound of hooves faded completely into the dark. Then her knees wanted to bend, and she did not let them. Jack turned to look at her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "You all right?" he said finally. "Yes." "You mentioned the federal marshal on purpose." "Yes." "To let him know Percy was already gone. To let him know it was already too late to stop it." She let out a slow breath. "Whitaker has to know now. Rourke will ride straight back and tell him, which means we have—" She stopped. "How long before he does something we can't predict?" Jack said. "I don't know, and that's the problem." She turned and went back inside. "Come in. We need to think." They sat at the kitchen table for the second time that night, and the lamp between them felt like the only steady thing in a situation that was moving faster than either of them had planned for. "Whitaker knows the letters exist," Eliza said. "He knows Percy is going to Cheyenne. He knows we have copies here." She folded her hands on the table. "He has 3 options. He runs, he fights it legally, or he does something that makes all of this stop before it becomes official." "He's not going to run," Jack said immediately. "No. He's been building this for 15 years. He's not going to abandon it. So he fights it, or he does something drastic." She looked at Jack. "What would you do?" Jack was quiet for a moment. "I'd move to discredit the evidence before it could be filed. Get to the marshal before Percy does and claim the documents were stolen and tampered with. Put doubt in the process before the process starts." Eliza nodded slowly. "Which means Percy might not be safe on the road." The sentence landed between them like a dropped weight. Jack was already standing. "He left 6 hours ago. If Whitaker sends someone fast, he's taking the northern pass." She was on her feet too. "Whitaker's men would take the main road. They might not know about the pass." "Might," Jack said. "I know." She grabbed her coat. "How fast can you ride?" "Faster than I did tonight, apparently." He was already at the door. "I'll go after Percy. If you catch up to him, don't turn back. Keep going. Get to Cheyenne." "What about you? If Whitaker decides to come here directly. Henry is here. Tom is here. She met his eyes. Go. Percy is alone, and he doesn't know they're coming. Jack held her gaze for one moment. There was something in it she didn't have time to name. Then he went. She listened to his horse leave and stood in the silence of the house and thought very deliberately and carefully about what Caleb Whitaker was doing right now and what he was going to do next. She had been right that cornered men made mistakes. She had believed that. She still believed it. But she also knew that cornered men sometimes made violent mistakes, and violence had a way of changing the shape of everything around it. She went to her father's desk and wrote a fourth letter, this one addressed to Judge Walter Harlan himself. She wrote it carefully. She told him that she knew about his relationship with Whitaker's campaign funding. She told him that she had evidence of the forgery and that it would be in federal hands before noon. She told him that he had a choice to continue protecting a man who was about to be exposed regardless and go down with him, or to step aside from the Monroe case publicly and on record before the federal filing made his position untenable. She did not threaten him. She did not need to. The facts were the threat. She sealed it and wrote his name on the front and set it with the other copies in the loose board under the kitchen floor where her father had kept cash in hard years. Then she woke Henry again. I need you to take something to Judge Harlan's house, she said. Now, leave it on his doorstep and don't knock. He'll find it in the morning. Henry looked at the letter, then at her. You're playing a lot of pieces at once. I'm playing all of them, she said. Because this is the only move I get. Henry took the letter and went. Eliza was alone in the house. She sat down in her father's chair, and she did something she had not allowed herself to do in the 16 days since she had walked out of that courthouse. She let the fear in, not the cold, functional alertness of the past hours. The real fear. The fear of losing everything her father had built. The fear of having moved too fast and miscalculated somewhere. The fear of people she was responsible for Henry Tom Jack somewhere on a dark road being hurt because of choices she had made. She let it in, and she sat with it, and then she said quietly to the room, I know what I'm doing, Papa. I think I know what I'm doing. The house didn't answer, but the silence felt less empty than it had 2 weeks ago, and she took that for what it was. She did not sleep again that night. By dawn, Henry was back. By mid-morning, she had gotten word through Agnes at the survey office, a careful coded message they had arranged that Percy had made it through the pass without incident and was believed to be 2 hours from Cheyenne. The relief was physical. She sat down on the porch steps and put her face in her hands for 30 seconds, not crying, just breathing, just letting the accumulated tension of the past 8 hours move through her. Then she heard horses again, but these ones were coming from town, not from the Whitaker direction. And they were not moving like men on a mission. They were moving like a delegation, 3 riders, and behind them a buggy. She was on her feet and on the steps when they pulled up. She recognized 2 of the riders, Ben Calloway, who ran the feed store, and whose father had been friends with her father since before Eliza was born, and a man named George Nast, who owned the livery stable. The third she didn't know. The buggy carried a woman, Margaret Tolliver, 60 years old, who had homesteaded the Tolliver property with her late husband and had been the de facto moral authority of the Black Hollow community for 30 years. Eliza looked at them. Mrs. Tolliver, she said carefully. Ben, George. Margaret Tolliver stepped down from the buggy without assistance and walked to the foot of the porch steps and looked up at Eliza with an expression that was complicated and direct. And not unkind. We heard about last night, she said. Word travels, Eliza said. She had said that before to Jack on a different night. It felt like something she was going to spend the rest of her life saying in this county. 5 armed men in the middle of the night, Margaret said. We heard, and we heard about the federal marshal being notified. And we heard, she paused briefly, that there are letters, in Caleb Whitaker's handwriting, that concern more than just your father's property. The third rider, the one Eliza didn't know, said, My name is Edward Marsh. Clara Marsh was my sister. Eliza went very still. I've been looking for this for 2 years, he said. His voice was tightly controlled. My sister lost everything. She's been in a boarding house in Casper for 2 years. I've been trying to find someone who could prove what happened to her, and I couldn't because no one in any of these counties would talk, and every record I found had either been destroyed or—" He stopped. "Is it true? Are there letters?" "Yes," Eliza said. He closed his eyes for a moment. Margaret Tolliver said, "Eliza, I owe you an apology." Eliza looked at her. "When this started, when the dead appeared and the court date was set, I told Ben Calloway that it was a complicated situation and that it wasn't my place to get involved." Margaret said it steadily without flinching from it. "I said that about a family I have known for 30 years. I said it because I was afraid of Caleb Whitaker, and I dressed that fear up as prudence, and I'm not going to do that anymore." She looked at Eliza directly. "What do you need?" The words hit Eliza somewhere she hadn't expected. She had been angry at the community's silence. She had understood it intellectually, but hearing it named out loud by the person who had been silent without excuse or deflection, that hit differently. She took a breath. "Right now," she said, "I need people Whitaker can't threaten. People with standing in this community who can be witnesses to what has happened on this property." She looked at all of them. "I need you to be here when this comes to a head. Because it is going to come to a head today." Margaret Tolliver nodded. "Then we're staying." Ben Calloway got down from his horse. "Tell us where you need us." By noon, there were 11 people at Monroe Ranch. By 1 o'clock, the number was 14. They came in ones and twos, people who had heard about the night's events and made decisions that had clearly been building in them for longer than the 16 days of this particular crisis. A ranching family from the North Quarter who had lost water access 2 years ago and blamed Whitaker, but had no proof. The widow of a man who had sold his property to Whitaker under pressure he had never fully explained. A young couple who had tried to get a loan for their homestead and been told without explanation that no credit was available to them. They came because something had cracked open that had been sealed shut for a long time. Eliza looked at the people in her yard and felt something shift in her chest, not triumph, not yet, but something like the moment before dawn, when the dark starts to lighten, and you can't quite see it happening, but you know it is. Jack rode back at 2 in the afternoon. He came through the gate and stopped his horse and looked at the 14 people in the yard with an expression of visible shock that he controlled quickly, but not quite quickly enough. Eliza walked out to meet him. "Percy made it," she said. "Percy made it." He dismounted. He was at the marshal's office by 9 this morning. The marshal reviewed the Holloway analysis and the letters, and Eliza, he has another case open against Whitaker. Different county, same method. Percy's evidence connected directly to a federal investigation that's been stalled for lack of documentation for 8 months. He held her gaze. "They're coming here. The marshal and 2 deputies plus a federal examiner. They'll be in Black Hollow by late afternoon." The air left her lungs again, the good kind this time. "He didn't know he was walking into federal territory," she said softly. "He picked the wrong woman to steal from," Jack said. And there was something in his voice when he said it, not pride exactly, because it wasn't his to feel pride about, something closer to wonder. She started to respond, and then she heard it. From the road. From the direction of town. Not riders this time. Caleb Whitaker came in his own carriage, which was the most expensive vehicle in the county, pulled by matched gray horses and driven by his personal driver. Sheriff Orville Cates rode alongside him. Behind the carriage were 4 men on horses. Not Rourke. This time Rourke had apparently not returned from wherever he'd gone after last night, but men Eliza recognized as Whitaker's standing ranch employees. He had come himself. That told her everything about how desperate he was. Caleb Whitaker stepped down from his carriage with the careful deliberateness of a man who was performing calm he did not entirely feel. He was immaculately dressed as always. He looked at the 14 people in the yard and at Jack beside Eliza and at the small crowd that had arranged itself without planning along the fence and the barn wall, and she could see him processing it, the change in arithmetic, the thing he hadn't anticipated. He walked to the porch steps. He looked at Eliza. "This has gone far enough," he said. "It has," Eliza agreed. "I'd like to speak with you privately." There's no version of this that happens privately, she said. There are 14 witnesses in this yard. Sheriff Cates is present, and there will be a federal marshal on this property within approximately 2 hours. She kept her voice level. Anything you say to me, you can say in front of them. Something moved in his face. Controlled, but visible. You're making a mistake, he said. The letters you're claiming exist. They exist, Eliza said. August Holloway has examined the forgery on my father's loan document. Leonard Greer has provided a statement. And 7 letters in your handwriting describing the operation you have run in this and neighboring counties for 15 years are currently in the possession of the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne. She paused. Along with information connecting your activities to the death of Henry Sutton in Fremont County. The yard went absolutely silent. Caleb Whitaker looked at her for a long moment. And for the first time in the 16 days of this, she saw something she had never seen in him before. He didn't look powerful. He looked old. This is over, she said quietly. Not just for my father's ranch, all of it. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then very quietly he said, You have no idea what you've done. I know exactly what I've done, she said. I followed the evidence. I found the people who were afraid to speak and I gave them a reason not to be. And I made sure what you built in the dark got pulled into the light. She held his gaze. You came to that courthouse and told me I had no options. But you were wrong. I had one option you never once considered. What option? The truth, she said simply. You never considered that I might just tell the truth and make enough people listen. Caleb Whitaker looked at her, and she saw him understand in that moment that it was real, not a bluff, not a negotiating position. Real, done, finished. Sheriff Cates, who had been standing beside the carriage with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground, cleared his throat. Mr. Whitaker, he said very quietly, I think we should go. Whitaker didn't move for another long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his carriage without another word. The yard watched him go. The sound of his carriage moving down the road was different from the sounds of the night before. No urgency, no suppressed force. Just a man leaving a place he would not return to as the same man he had been when he arrived. Edward Marsh, standing at the fence, let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 2 years. Margaret Tolliver said quietly, My God. Jack was standing beside Eliza close enough that she was aware of it, and she turned to look at him, and he was looking back at her with an expression that was steady and present, and something she did not have a name for yet. You did it, he said. We're not finished, she said. No, he agreed. But you did that part. She almost argued. Then she looked at the people in her yard, the ones who had come because she had given them a reason to, the ones who had stood here and witnessed something that could not be unseen, and she thought maybe he was right. Maybe that part was done. The federal marshal arrived at 4:17 in the afternoon. He was a compact, serious man named Braddock, who moved with the efficiency of someone who had very little interest in performing authority because he had enough actual authority that performance was unnecessary. He arrived with 2 deputies and the federal examiner Percy had mentioned, and Percy himself, who had ridden back with them, and who looked like a man who had not slept in 20 hours and was too energized by events to care. Braddock shook Eliza's hand on the porch steps. Miss Monroe, he said, I've read what your attorney filed this morning. I want you to know that the investigation you've effectively cracked open has been on our books since late 1883. We had suspicions and no documentation. You provided the documentation. Leonard Greer provided the documentation, Eliza said. He made a choice. Braddock nodded. He did. We'll want to discuss his cooperation formally. He looked toward the road. We'll be executing an order for Mr. Whitaker's property records tonight. His attorney will fight it, but the federal warrant supersedes the county court. What about Judge Harlan? She asked. Braddock looked at her steadily. Judge Harlan sent a communication to our office at 10 this morning, recusing himself from the Monroe debt proceeding and requesting a review of his handling of 3 other cases over the past 4 years. He paused. We received it after Percy's filing, not before, but we received it. Eliza thought about the letter Henry had left on Harlan's doorstep. She thought about a 60-year-old man sitting in his house in the early morning with that letter in his hands, making a calculation and then making a choice. All right, she said. Braddock went to work. The next 3 hours were the organized, controlled chaos of a legal process that had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Documents reviewed, statements taken, the federal examiner going through the forged loan agreement with Holloway's analysis in hand and confirming the findings in writing on record. Eliza answered every question calmly and completely. Percy handled the legal details with a precision that surprised even himself, she thought. Jack stayed close without hovering, present, watchful, available, not taking up space that wasn't his to take up. By the time the sun was going low and the federal team had what they needed to proceed, the Monroe case was effectively over. The forged debt was nullified by the federal examiner's finding. The foreclosure proceeding was suspended pending the broader investigation. The ranch was hers. But she didn't feel the way she had expected to feel. She had thought the moment it was over she would feel something large and clear. Relief. Victory. Something definite. Instead, she stood on her porch as the federal party prepared to leave, and she felt the full weight of everything it had cost. The 16 days of no sleep. The fear she had kept controlled and stored below the surface. The grief for her father that she had held together through the entire fight because she couldn't afford to let it out. She felt all of it come up at once, and it was not triumphant. It was just real. Percy came and stood beside her and didn't say anything, which was the right call. Then Jack came and stood on her other side. "What are you feeling?" he said. She thought about it for a moment. "Tired," she said, "and sad, and grateful." She looked at the yard, at the people beginning to drift toward their homes. And angry still, because Clara Marsh is still in a boarding house, and Henry Sutton is still dead, and winning this doesn't fix those things. Jack nodded. He didn't try to reframe it or soften it. "No," he said, "it doesn't." "But it stops it happening again," she said. "Yes, that has to be enough for tonight." "It does." She looked at him. "You could have left any time in the last 2 weeks," she said. "When it got dangerous, when Rourke came, any of it." Jack looked at the road where Whitaker's carriage had gone. "I know," he said. "Why didn't you—" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because some things are worth standing for," he said. "You reminded me of that the first night. I hadn't remembered it in a while." Eliza looked at him, and the lamplight from the open doorway was falling across his face, and she was 16 days into the hardest thing she had ever done, and she was tired all the way to her bones. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make supper." "I can make supper." "You can make coffee," she said. "I've tasted your coffee." The smallest possible smile moved across his face. "My coffee is fine." "Your coffee is barely acceptable." "That seems harsh." "Come inside, Jack." He followed her through the door. And behind them, the Wyoming plain stretched out into the darkening evening, and the Monroe Ranch stood on its land the way it had always stood, the way Thomas Monroe had built it to stand. And for the first time in 16 days, the lights inside it felt like something that was going to last. The supper she made that night was simple beans and cornbread, and the last of the salt pork. And she and Jack sat at her father's table and ate it without much conversation, the way people do when they've been through something together, and the something is still too close to talk about cleanly. Percy had gone back to town. The federal team had gone back to wherever federal teams went when they were done turning a county upside down. Henry and Tom had eaten in the bunkhouse, and the 14 people who had filled the yard that afternoon had gone home to their own families and their own suppers, and the particular feeling of having done something they would be telling their grandchildren about. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet in 16 days. Eliza cleared the plates, and Jack made coffee. She let him make it without comment this time, and it was in fact barely acceptable, and they sat with it for a while in the kind of silence that has texture to it that means something. "What happens to Whitaker now?" Jack said. "The federal investigation takes over. It won't be fast. These things never are." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "But Braddock seems like a man who finishes what he starts. And Harlan, he recused himself and requested a review. Whether that saves him or not, I don't know, but he made the choice." She paused. "I think he was more afraid than corrupt. There's a difference. Not a large one, but it's there." Jack nodded. "And Greer?" "I think Greer is somewhere east of here with his daughter, and I hope he stays east for a while." She looked at the table. "He was a coward for a long time, but at the end he did the right thing. People are more than their worst years." Jack looked at her. "You believe that?" "I have to," she said. "Otherwise, what are we doing?" He was quiet for a moment. "My father was a coward," he said. Said it plainly like a fact he had long ago accepted. "He had a chance to stand up for my mother against her brother, who was taking money from her that was rightly hers. And he didn't. He said it wasn't his business." Jack looked at his coffee. "My mother lost everything she'd saved for 20 years because my father decided not to make it his business." Eliza waited. "I left home at 17, he said. "I told myself I was leaving because there was nothing there for me. But I was really leaving because I couldn't stand looking at him every day and knowing he'd chosen to be small." He paused. "I've been moving ever since. 6 years, 8 years I stopped counting after a while, just kept moving." "Until Black Hollow," she said. "Until Black Hollow." He met her eyes. "I almost didn't stop. I almost rode through. I heard the talk at the saloon about a woman fighting Whitaker alone, and I thought that's not your problem, Jack. Keep writing." "What stopped you?" "I don't know exactly." He looked at the photograph on the wall, Thomas Monroe squinting into the sun. "Maybe I was tired of riding." Eliza looked at him steadily. "You're not a coward." "I know I'm not," he said. "I spent a long time proving that to myself. Went looking for every situation where the right thing was the hard thing just to make sure." He set down his cup. "But being brave without a reason to be brave is just restlessness with better press." She almost smiled. "And now? Now I think I found a reason." He held her gaze. "A few of them." The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp between them made the space feel small and close and separate from everything that had happened outside it. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. "Don't say things you can't stand behind," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I'm not." She looked at the table, at the lamp, back at him. "I need to sleep about 14 hours. You should. And tomorrow everything starts again, cattle fencing, winter preparation. The ranch doesn't stop because the legal situation resolved." "I know. I'm saying," she stopped. "You're saying you have a life to build, and you don't know what I'm doing here past tonight," Jack said. "Yes." "I'd like to stay," he said. "If the work is there and the terms are fair." "The terms are the same as before. You work, you get paid, you get the bunkhouse. Those are fine terms. And Jack." She met his eyes one more time. "I meant what I said that first night. I don't need saving." "I know you don't," he said. "I stopped thinking about saving you approximately 2 hours after I arrived." "What did you start thinking about?" He was quiet for a moment. "Keeping up," he said. "Mostly." This time she did smile, small and tired and real. "Go get some sleep," she said. "We start early tomorrow." He went. She listened to the door close behind him and sat alone for a little while longer with the lamp and the quiet and her father's photograph. And she said goodnight to him the way she had been saying goodnight since he died privately and without performance. Then she went to bed and slept for the first time in 16 days without anything chasing her into the dark. The morning came hard and bright and cold, the way Wyoming mornings did in late October, and the ranch needed everything it always needed. She was up before dawn. Jack was already at the barn. They worked through the morning with Henry and Tom, and nobody talked about the day before, and somehow that was exactly right. The return to the physical dailiness of the work was its own kind of relief, its own proof that the ground was still solid. It was Percy who arrived at mid-morning with the news that changed the shape of everything again. He rode up, looking like a man carrying something heavy and not sure how to put it down, and Eliza met him at the gate and read his face before he opened his mouth. "What happened?" she said. Percy dismounted and took a breath. "Two things. The first, Braddock moved on Whitaker's property records last night. They found the correspondence files he kept at his house." He paused. "Eliza, there are 43 additional cases, not 7. 43 documented transactions across 6 counties in the past 15 years in which Whitaker used forged documentation to acquire property from recently bereaved individuals. 43. She heard the number and felt it settle on her in a way that was not surprise but was still staggering. She had known it was bigger than her. She had known since Percy spread his research notes on the table and showed her Ridgeline and Fremont County and Carbon County. She had known it was a machine. But 43. 43 families. 43 moments like the one she had stood in alone trying to understand how the ground had disappeared beneath them. "The second thing," Percy said. He looked at her carefully. "Whitaker tried to leave last night. His carriage was found at the Casper train station at midnight. He had bags. He had cash." Percy stopped. "Braddock's deputies were already there. He's been taken into federal custody." Eliza stared at him. "He ran," she said. "He tried. 15 years of building everything in this county and he ran." Men who've never faced real consequences often don't know how to face them when they arrive, Percy said. He thought he could outmaneuver anything. He'd done it so many times, and then when he couldn't, he didn't have anything else. Eliza looked at the road, at the place where Whitaker's carriage had turned around and gone back to town the day before, carrying a man who had sat across from her in a courtroom less than 3 weeks ago and told her she had no options. She thought about what that must have felt like to have spent 15 years certain that power was permanent, and then watch it go in 48 hours because one woman in a dead man's ranch had decided to hold on. She didn't feel satisfaction about it. She had expected to. She didn't. She felt the 43 families. "What happens now to the properties?" she asked. "That's complicated," Percy said. "Legally complicated, and it won't be fast. But Braddock told me this morning that his office is treating recovery of the affected properties as a priority. Clara Marsh's family has already been contacted." He looked at her. "Edward Marsh is going to Casper today to get his sister." Eliza closed her eyes for a moment. 1 breath. 2. "Good," she said. "That's good." Percy was watching her with an expression that was halfway between professional and personal. "How are you?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me in a week." He nodded like that was the right answer. "There's one more thing. The county commission is meeting this afternoon. With Harlan recused and the Whitaker situation public, they're moving to appoint an interim judge and review all the debt proceedings Harlan handled in the past 4 years. Your case will be formally cleared on record." He paused. "It's not just about you getting your ranch back. It's about making what happened to you part of the official record that something was wrong." "My father's name," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "Make sure it's in the record, Percy. Make sure they understand that Thomas Monroe didn't owe Caleb Whitaker a single dollar, that the debt never existed, that he died with a clean name and a whole ranch, and they need to say that in writing." "I'll make sure," Percy said. He left 20 minutes later, and Eliza stood at the gate for a long time after he was gone. Jack came and stood beside her. He had heard enough from the barn. 43, she said without turning. "I heard. It's not a small thing we did. I knew it was bigger than the ranch, but 43. She shook her head slowly. "I keep thinking about all of them, in their own courtrooms, in their own impossible moments. And nobody came." "You came," Jack said. "Not for them, for myself. Fighting for yourself honestly is how you end up helping everyone else, he said. You didn't know about the 43. You knew about one your father, and you refused to let that stand. He looked at her. The rest follows from the one. It always does. She turned to look at him. You're smarter than you let on, she said. I let on plenty, he said. You're just not always paying attention. That pulled something out of her that she hadn't expected, a real laugh, brief and a little rough from disuse, but real. It startled her. It startled Jack, too. She could tell a small shift in his expression, something lightening. Come on, she said. There's fence that needs checking in the north pasture. They went. The county commission meeting that afternoon was the most attended in Black Hollow's recorded history. Eliza knew because Margaret Tolliver sent word with a boy on a fast horse, and later Percy confirmed it. Over 60 people in a room that held 40, with the overflow standing in the hallway, and 3 men reportedly listening from the window outside. The commission formally suspended the Monroe debt proceeding. They appointed an interim judge named Harold Fitch from Laramie, a man with no ties to Whitaker and no ties to Harlan, who reviewed the forged documentation and signed the nullification order before the meeting was an hour old. The Monroe Ranch belonged to Eliza Monroe. Not tentatively, not pending further review, completely legally and on the record. Percy brought her the paper at 4 in the afternoon and put it in her hands, and she stood in her father's kitchen and held it and read it 3 times. She waited to feel something large and defining. What she felt was quiet, not empty, not disappointed. Quiet the way a room is quiet after a long noise finally stops, when you can hear things you couldn't hear before. The small sounds of the ranch outside, the wind, somewhere far away one of the cattle, the familiar creak of the house settling in the dropping temperature. Her father's house. Her house. Her father's land. Her land. She set the paper on the table and said to the empty kitchen, I did it, Papa. Then she went outside because she needed air, and she stood on the porch in the cold afternoon and breathed it in, and Jack came around the corner of the barn and saw her face and stopped. The papers came, he said. Yes. He walked over and stood at the foot of the porch steps. I thought I'd feel like winning, she said. I thought there would be a moment where it felt finished and right and complete. She looked at the yard. I feel sad and grateful, and like I want my father here so I could tell him. You've been telling him, Jack said. You've been talking to him this whole time. She looked at him sharply. I hear you sometimes, he said. At night. I'm not listening on purpose. You talk to him. She absorbed that, felt the mild embarrassment of it, and then the embarrassment passed because it was Jack, and he was saying it without judgment, without softness, either just saying it straight the way he said most things. He would have liked you, she said. I would have been afraid of him, Jack said. I get the impression he had very clear ideas about what kind of man his daughter deserved. He did. She paused. He also had very clear ideas about judging people by what they do when it costs them something. By that measure, Jack said carefully, I hope I've done all right. By that measure, she said, you've done better than all right. Something moved between them in the cold air, something that had been building in small increments since the first night, and neither of them moved toward it or away from it. They just stood in it. Then the sound of another rider broke the moment, not with urgency. This time, just the ordinary sound of someone coming up the road, and Eliza looked up and recognized the horse before she recognized the rider. It was Edward Marsh. He was alone, and he was riding carefully, and on the horse behind him, sharing his saddle, was a woman. Clara Marsh. Eliza had never met her. She had only known her as a name. A woman in a boarding house in Casper who had lost what was hers the same way Eliza had almost lost what was hers. She had been a symbol to Eliza for 2 weeks, a shape in the argument, the evidence that this was real and had happened before. She was a real person. She was 41 years old, and she looked smaller than Eliza had pictured her. And she looked at the Monroe Ranch with an expression that was complicated and raw and not quite able to settle into any single emotion. Edward helped her down, and she stood in the yard and looked at Eliza. You're the one, Clara said. Her voice was rougher than Eliza expected, a voice that had been through a long time of swallowing things. I'm Eliza Monroe. I know who you are. Clara looked at the ranch at the house at the barn. They told me what you did, how you did it. She stopped. I want you to know I tried. After it happened to me, I tried to fight it, but I didn't have... She stopped again. You didn't have the documents yet, Eliza said quietly. They didn't exist yet where you could find them. It wasn't because you weren't strong enough. Clara looked at her. Everyone let me believe it was because I wasn't strong enough, she said. 2 years. I believed it. Eliza came down the porch steps. You weren't the problem, she said. He was a machine, and you walked into it before anyone had found the way to break it. She held Clara's gaze. You survived 2 years of losing everything, and you're still here. That's not weakness. Clara's eyes went bright. She didn't cry. She had the look of a woman who had used her crying up and was running on something drier now. But her eyes went bright, and she pressed her lips together, and she nodded once small. Will I get the property back? She said. My husband built that land from nothing. His grandfather's tools are still in the barn. They left his tools. Percy Gaines is already working on it, Eliza said. He's the best person in this county to push on the recovery process. And the federal investigation puts it in a different category than a civil claim. It's part of a pattern of fraud, which means the burden of recovery is on Whitaker's assets, not on you. How long? I don't know, Eliza said honestly. Not as long as it would have been without what happened this week. Clara nodded again. She looked at the ranch once more, the way someone looks at something that reminds them of something else they can't quite reach. I'm sorry about your father. I'm sorry about your husband. They stood there for a moment, two women who had been reduced to cases and symbols and legal problems, looking at each other as what they actually were. Edward Marsh said, We should get back to town before dark. Clara turned to go. Then she stopped and turned back. Miss Monroe, she said. Thank you. I know you did it for yourself. I know it wasn't for me. But thank you anyway. Eliza watched them right away. Jack appeared beside her. She said the right thing, he said. She did. You did do it for yourself. I know. She watched the road where they had gone. And for my father. And because it was the right thing. All of those at once. She paused. I don't think the reasons have to be simple. No, Jack agreed. The best reasons never are. The days that followed were different from the days before, but they were not easy. There was a moment she had expected it, and it came exactly when she expected it, 3 days after the legal resolution, when the crisis had passed, and the adrenaline that had been holding her upright for 3 weeks finally let go. She was in the barn at mid-morning, and she sat down on a hay bale because her legs decided that's what was happening, and she sat there with the smell of horses and hay and cold wood around her, and the grief she had been carrying below the surface since the morning. She found her father's body came up all at once. She didn't try to stop it. There was nothing useful in stopping it anymore. She cried for 20 minutes alone in the barn, and then she heard the barn door and looked up, and Jack was there, standing just inside the door, and he had clearly come in for something routine, and found her instead. He didn't say anything. He didn't move toward her or away from her. He just stayed. She appreciated that more than she would have appreciated any other response. After a minute, she said, I haven't done this yet. I know, he said. I kept putting it somewhere I couldn't feel it. You had to. He should be here, she said. He should be the one who got to see this. He should have seen Whitaker taken into custody, and the commission meeting, and the paper that says the ranch is mine. He should have been here for it. He was, Jack said simply. She looked at him. He built the thing you were fighting for, Jack said. He raised the person who fought for it. He's in everything that happened. He met her eyes. That's not nothing. She looked at the barn wall for a moment. No, she said. It's not. She got up and straightened her coat and went back to work. Jack went back to work too, and neither of them mentioned it again, and somehow that was exactly right. What she didn't expect, what nobody in the county had expected, was what happened 8 days after the federal arrest. Percy came back on a Tuesday morning with a different energy than any of his previous visits. Not heavy, not urgent, but careful. The way a man carries news, he isn't sure how to categorize. "The commission wants to speak with you," he said. She looked up from the ledger she'd been reviewing. "About what?" "About a proposal." He sat down across from her. "Braddock's office has frozen Whitaker's liquid assets pending the investigation. The properties he legally owned, the ones he acquired without fraud, the mill, the lumberyard, the legitimate ranch holdings, those go through probate and will eventually be auctioned." He paused. "But there's another category. 11 families who lost property in ways that can now be proven fraudulent. Properties that can be returned, but some of them, the owners died, or the families dispersed, or the property has been modified significantly by Whitaker's operations. Recovery is legally possible but practically complicated. And," she said, "the commission is proposing that your name be attached to the oversight of the recovery process. Not ownership. Oversight. A formal role in ensuring that the affected families, all 43 cases as they're identified, receive what they're owed." He looked at her. "They want you to be the person who makes sure this doesn't get lost in bureaucratic process." Eliza stared at him. "They want to give me a job," she said. "They want to give you a role," Percy said carefully. "With a formal appointment. It doesn't pay what Whitaker's operation paid, but it pays more than ranch work alone. And, Percy," she stopped him. "Why me? There are lawyers, commissioners, federal people." "Because you found it," he said simply. "Because you followed every thread when no one else would. Because 43 families have cases because of what you did, and there are 43 families who need someone who isn't a lawyer, or a politician, or a federal official. Someone who knows what it feels like to stand in that courtroom and hear those words." He looked at her steadily. "Someone who won't let it get lost." She sat with that for a long moment. "The ranch is still my priority," she said finally. "Of course. And I want Percy Gaines as the legal representative for the affected families." Percy blinked. Yes, obviously. And I want the commission to understand that I will do this exactly the way I did everything else. I won't make it comfortable. I won't let it move slowly because moving slowly is more convenient." She met his eyes. "If they want me involved, they get all of me involved." Percy looked at her with an expression she recognized. The same expression Jack got sometimes. That subtle recalibration. "They want all of you," he said. "That's exactly what they want." She closed the ledger. "Then tell them yes," she said. That evening, she told Jack about the commission offer while they were doing the late feeding, moving through the familiar routine with the ease of people who had worked together long enough that the choreography of shared labor had become natural. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Are you going to take it?" "I already said yes." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "Are you going to take it as in, are you ready to carry more?" he said. "Because you've been carrying a lot already, and this is more." She considered that. "My father used to say that the people who are most tired are usually the ones who most need to keep working. Not because rest isn't important, because purpose is more important than rest." She moved to the next stall. "I know what those 43 cases look like from the inside. I know what that courtroom feels like. I know what it's like to have no one come." She glanced at him. "So somebody should come." Jack was quiet for a while. "When I came to your gate that first night," he said, "I told you nobody should have to stand alone against people who think they're untouchable." "I remember." "I meant it as something I believed in principle," he said. "I didn't know I'd be standing here 6 months later still believing it with specific reference to one specific ranch." She stopped, turned to look at him. "6 months," she said. He met her eyes evenly. I'm not going anywhere, Eliza, unless you tell me to. She looked at him for a long moment. The barn was warm with the presence of the animals and the smell of hay, and outside the cold was coming down off the ridge the way it always did this time of year. And the ranch needed what it always needed, and the 43 families were out there waiting for someone to make sure they weren't forgotten. And her father's photograph was on the kitchen wall, and his boots were still on the porch where she'd left them because she wasn't ready to move them yet. I'm not going to tell you to, she said. Jack nodded once, small, like a man who has said what needed saying and doesn't need to add to it. She turned back to the work. He turned back to the work. And somewhere in the ordinary rhythm of that two people feeding cattle at the end of a very long day, neither of them carrying anything alone, something that had been broken for a long time in both of them was quietly without ceremony, beginning to mend. The winter came early that year, the way Wyoming winters sometimes did, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, a hard freeze in the second week of November that locked the ground and turned the ridge white overnight. Eliza worked through it. She had always worked through winters. Her father had taught her that the ranch didn't care about the calendar or the weather or what was happening in the county seat or in a federal courthouse 300 miles away. The cattle needed feeding in the cold, the same as they needed feeding in the warmth, and the fences didn't hold themselves, and the work was the work. But this winter was different from every winter before it, because this winter she was not doing it alone. Jack was there. Henry was there. Tom had brought his younger brother on as a hand in October. A quiet 18-year-old named Will, who worked hard and asked good questions, and reminded Eliza sometimes, in the way he looked at things he was learning for the first time of herself at that age. And once a week, Percy came with papers. The recovery process for the 43 families was not fast. She had known it wouldn't be fast. She had told the commission it wouldn't be fast, and she had told herself very firmly, in the moments when the bureaucratic slowness made her want to put her fist through a wall, that slow and certain was better than fast and incomplete. But there were moments that made it real in a way that cut through the legal language and the paperwork and the waiting. Clara Marsh got her property back on a Thursday in December. Percy brought the paperwork himself, drove out to the boarding house in Casper, where Clara had been living for 2 years, and put the deed in her hands. Clara called Eliza that evening through the telegraph office, a long, garbled, imperfect message that still managed to communicate the essential thing, and Eliza read it sitting at her father's desk and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since she'd first heard Clara's name. She wrote back. 2 sentences. Your husband built something that survived. So did you. A week later, a family named the Hendersons, a couple in their 60s, who had lost their grazing land in Carbon County 3 years earlier, came to Monroe Ranch in person. They had heard about Eliza through the recovery process. They drove 4 hours to thank her. Eliza met them on the porch and shook their hands and told them Percy Gaines was the person responsible for the legal work, and August Holloway was the person who cracked the evidence, and Leonard Greer was the person who had the courage at the end to do the right thing. Mr. Henderson looked at her and said, "But you're the person who didn't give up." She didn't know what to say to that, so she invited them in for coffee, and Jack made it. It was still barely acceptable, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked for an hour. And when the Hendersons left, Eliza stood on the porch watching their wagon go, and felt for the first time in a long time something that wasn't grief or anger or determination. Something that felt quietly and without fanfare like peace. Jack came and stood beside her. "You did something good," he said. "We did something good," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Spreading the credit around." He looked at her. "It's not a bad thing. But you should know that what you did in those 30 days is something most people wouldn't have done. I want to make sure you know that." She turned to look at him. "Why? Because you spend a lot of time thinking about the 43, about the ones you couldn't get back faster, about what it cost everyone else." He met her eyes. "I don't want you to forget what you built." She held his gaze. "I know what I built," she said quietly. "I just don't think it needs me to be proud of it. It needs me to keep working on it." Jack looked at her for a long moment. Thomas Monroe really did raise something remarkable. She looked away before the emotion could get to her face. "Come on," she said. "There's fence in the east pasture that isn't going to repair itself." He followed her as he always did, and neither of them needed to say anything more about it. The federal trial of Caleb Whitaker began in February in Cheyenne, and the proceedings were covered by 3 territorial newspapers and 1 paper out of Denver that had been following the story since Braddock's arrest. Eliza was called to testify. She had known she would be. Percy had prepared her, walked her through every question Whitaker's attorneys were likely to ask, every angle they would try to use to make her look unreliable or opportunistic or simply wrong. She had listened to Percy's preparation and nodded and taken notes and felt underneath all of it completely calm, because she had been in this situation before. She had stood in a room full of people who had already decided the outcome, and she had told the truth anyway, and it had mattered. She knew how to do this. She and Jack rode to Cheyenne together. Percy met them there. The courtroom was larger than Black Hollow's, a proper federal building, with high ceilings and a gallery that was full when Eliza walked in. She felt the eyes on her, and she did what her father had taught her. She held her spine straight and let the way she carried herself tell the room who she was before she opened her mouth. Caleb Whitaker sat at the defense table. She had not seen him since he walked away from her yard in the afternoon light, smaller than he'd ever looked, and she looked at him now with the same direct attention she had given him then. He did not look back. That told her everything she needed to know about where he was now. She took the stand. The federal prosecutor, a careful, methodical woman named Grace Aldridge, whom Eliza had met once before and immediately respected, walked her through the events beginning with her father's death and ending with Braddock's arrival at Monroe Ranch. Eliza answered every question clearly, without embellishment, without drama. Just the truth in the order it happened, exactly as it was. The defense attorney was a man named Harrington from Denver, expensive and smooth, and he came at her for 40 minutes with every angle Percy had predicted, and a few he hadn't. He suggested she had fabricated the story of the conversation in the courthouse. He suggested she had manipulated Leonard Greer. He suggested her relationship with Jack Dawson represented a financial motivation to discredit Whitaker. He suggested she had misread documents she lacked the legal sophistication to properly interpret. Eliza answered every question without raising her voice. At one point, Harrington said, "Miss Monroe, isn't it true that you had significant personal motivation to discredit Mr. Whitaker because your father's financial mismanagement had left the property genuinely encumbered?" She looked at him steadily. "My father managed his property well for 30 years, she said. "The debt was a forgery as established by a federal document examiner. My motivation was to prove that. I proved it." She paused. "The question you're asking assumes the forgery was real. It wasn't. And everyone in this room now has the documentation to confirm that." Harrington looked at her. She looked back. "No further questions," he said. She stepped down and walked back to her seat, and she felt the gallery watching her, and she sat beside Jack, who was looking straight ahead, and she heard him exhale very slowly through his nose. "Well," she said quietly. "You just made a Denver attorney say no further questions after 40 minutes, he said under his breath. "I think that's going well." She almost smiled. She controlled it because this was a federal courtroom, but it was close. The trial lasted 4 days. The verdict took the jury 3 hours. Guilty on 11 counts of fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy, and 1 count of accessory to wrongful death in the case of Henry Sutton of Fremont County. The wrongful death count was the one that had been added late, based on a letter from Whitaker's files that referenced Sutton's declining health and the timing of the forged document, the letter that Percy had read in her kitchen and set down. When the verdict was read, Eliza sat very still. She thought about Henry Sutton, who had died in disputed circumstances and whose family had spent years not being believed. She thought about the letter with its cold, specific language. She thought about Caleb Whitaker, who had looked at a dying man and decided to move fast. She thought about her father, who had died of illness naturally in his own bed, and about the specific relief even now, even after everything, of knowing that. of knowing Whitaker hadn't gotten to him, that her father had simply died the way men died and the theft had come after, and that was terrible, but it was not the worst version. She breathed. Jack put his hand on the table beside hers. Not touching, just near. She put her hand on his. Percy on her other side was already writing notes. Whitaker was sentenced 6 weeks later. 15 years federal prison. His assets, the legitimate ones, everything built over 40 years in Black Hollow County, were liquidated as part of the restitution order to the affected families. The mill changed hands to a cooperative of county businesses. The lumber yard went to its longtime foreman, a man named Sykes, who had worked for Whitaker for 20 years without knowing the full shape of what he was part of, and who cried when he signed the purchase papers, Percy said, from something that was more complicated than joy. The Whitaker land itself, 11,000 acres, the largest single property in the county, was divided. And here was the thing nobody had expected, including Eliza. The commission, in consultation with Braddock's office and the Federal Land Authority, determined that a portion of the Whitaker acreage should be held in trust for community use grazing rights, accessible to smaller ranchers, water access for the properties along the eastern boundary that had been squeezed out over Whitaker's years of consolidation. They asked Eliza to oversee the trust. She said yes before Percy finished explaining what it entailed. "You didn't even let me finish," Percy said. "I heard enough," she said. "Water access for the eastern properties, grazing rights for small ranchers. Yes. There's administrative work involved." "Percy." She looked at him. "Yes." He stopped arguing and wrote it down. Spring came. The way spring came in Wyoming after a hard winter was not gentle. It was abrupt, almost aggressive, as if the land had been holding its breath and suddenly couldn't anymore. The snow came off the ridge fast, the creek ran high and cold and clear, and the cattle moved into the new grass with the particular energy of animals that had been waiting for something to change. Eliza stood on her porch one morning in April and listened to the ranch breathing around her and thought about the morning 11 months ago when she had stood in a courtroom and heard the words that were supposed to end everything. She thought about all the mornings between then and now. She thought about Jack's horse coming up the road that first evening, and the lamp burning low on the kitchen table, and Percy's shaking hands when he sat across from Whitaker's documentation for the first time. She thought about August Holloway in Cheyenne, with his magnifying glass and his certainty, and Leonard Greer setting a brass key on a desk and buying his daughter's safety with it. She thought about Henry and Tom and Will, who were already working in the East Pasture, and about Margaret Tolliver, who had brought 14 people to her yard because she finally stopped being afraid. She thought about 43 families. She thought about her father. The door behind her opened, and Jack came out with 2 cups of coffee. Still barely acceptable, it had not improved, and handed her one, and stood beside her on the porch. They stood for a while without talking. That was something they did well, she and Jack. The comfortable silences had appeared sometime in January, emerging so gradually that she had only noticed them in retrospect the moment when the quiet between them stopped feeling like space that needed filling and started feeling like its own kind of conversation. "There's something I want to say," Jack said. She waited. "I came to this gate 11 months ago and I told you your fate wasn't sealed." He looked at his coffee. "I said it because I believed it. But I want you to know that I understood it differently then than I do now." She turned to look at him. "I thought it meant you could win," he said. "That the situation wasn't hopeless, that there was a path through." He paused. "That's what I meant. But what I learned watching you do what you did is that it was never about whether you could win. It was about whether you would let someone else decide what you were worth." He looked at her directly. "And you never did. Not for a single day." She held his gaze. "It costs something," she said. "Everything real does. I was afraid," she said. "Every day. I held it down where it couldn't slow me down, but it was there." "I know," he said. "I saw it sometimes, late at night at the table. You thought you were hiding it." "Was I not?" "You were mostly hiding it." Something moved in his expression. "But I saw it. And I want you to know that being afraid and doing it anyway is not a smaller thing than not being afraid. It's a larger thing." She looked at him for a long moment. "Jack," she said. "Yeah. Are you going to say what you're building toward, or are we going to keep talking around it?" He almost smiled. "I'm trying to say it with the right words." "You've been saying things with the right words for 11 months. Just say it." He turned fully to face her. "I love you," he said. "I've been trying to figure out how to say that without it sounding like something you don't need because you don't need it. You don't need anything from me. You've proven that. But it's not about need." He held her gaze steady. "I love you, and I want to stay, and I want to build something here beside you. And I'm asking whether that's something you want." The morning air was cold and clear, and the ranch was moving around them alive and working the way her father had built it to be. And Eliza Monroe stood on her porch with a barely acceptable cup of coffee and looked at the man beside her. She thought about her father saying, "Never let another person tell you what you are worth." She thought about the courthouse, the 30 days, the letters in the leather case, the federal marshal and the jury and the verdict. She thought about 11 months of Jack Dawson, not once trying to make himself necessary, not once making her fight around him, not once asking her to be smaller or slower or quieter. She thought about love, what it had looked like in her father's house, practical and daily, and completely reliable. The kind that didn't announce itself. The kind that just showed up. "I want that," she said. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically. Just something released. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They stood on the porch in the April morning, and the cattle were moving in the east pasture, and Will was fixing the fence her father had built 30 years ago. And Margaret Tolliver was probably already in her kitchen writing the letter she'd told Eliza last week she was going to write to the territorial newspaper about what had happened in Black Hollow County and what had changed. Inside on the kitchen table were 3 folders of paperwork for the Recovery Trust, 2 letters from families in Carbon County whose cases Percy was close to resolving, and a note from Edward Marsh saying Clara was back on her property and that the first thing she'd done was go to the barn and find her husband's tools exactly where she'd left them. Outside the ridge was green for the first time since October, and the creek was running, and the Monroe Ranch was standing on its land the way Thomas Monroe had built it to stand, not as a monument, not as a symbol, but as a working thing, a living thing, a thing that had been worth fighting for. Later that day, when the morning work was done, Eliza went to her father's desk and took out the letter he had started writing to her the night before he lost consciousness and never finished. She had read it hundreds of times. She knew every word. It ended mid-sentence. "There are people in this world who will try to tell you that you have no options. Eliza and I want you to know." She had spent 11 months knowing what came after that unfinished sentence. She hadn't needed him to finish it because she had finished it herself with everything she had done. She folded the letter carefully and put it back where she kept it in the drawer beneath his photograph. And she went back outside to where Jack was waiting, and the work was waiting, and the afternoon was full of the ordinary particular business of a life that was hers, completely, legally, irrevocably hers, and she did not look back. The story of what happened in Black Hollow County in the autumn of 1885 traveled further than Eliza Monroe ever expected it to. Percy wrote it up formally for the territorial legal record, which meant it became part of the documentation that shaped new property protection laws passed in Wyoming Territory 2 years later, laws that required independent verification of post-death debt claims before any foreclosure proceeding could begin. The newspaper article Margaret Tolliver pushed for ran in 3 territorial papers and was reprinted in Denver. It told the story plainly without embellishment, and it named names Whitakers, Harlan's, Greer's, and Eliza's. The letters she received after that article filled a box that she kept on the shelf above her father's desk. From women in similar situations. From families who had lost things and now had a name for what had happened to them and a legal framework to fight it. From a few people who just wanted to write to someone who had done what they hadn't been able to do. She answered every one of them. It took her most of the following winter writing by lamplight after the ranch work was done. Jack across the table, reading or doing the accounts, or simply present the way he was simply present, which was one of the things she loved most about him, his ability to occupy space without demanding it. Some of the letters she answered with information, some with the names of lawyers in their counties who could help. Some she answered with nothing more than acknowledgement, "I hear you. What happened to you was wrong. It can be fought." She never promised outcomes. She had learned too much about the distance between fighting and winning to promise outcomes. But she told the truth, which was that fighting was worth it even when the outcome was uncertain, because the alternative was letting someone else write your ending. The 43 cases were not all resolved in the same way or on the same timeline. Some families got their land back. Some received financial restitution from the liquidated Whitaker assets. Some had lost too much for too long. The land changed hands legitimately. In the interim, families had dispersed. The legal path was blocked. For those, the outcome was acknowledgement and partial compensation, and the knowledge that they were believed. Eliza had known from the beginning that this was what some of them would receive. She had made peace with it, but she kept pushing on every case until it reached whatever resolution it could reach. Percy beside her, methodical and tireless, in a way that the younger version of him, the shaking-handed 28-year-old in that first courtroom, would not have recognized. One evening in the second winter, Percy sat across from her after they'd closed the last file on a Carbon County case that had been stubborn for 8 months, and he looked at her with an expression she had learned to read as Percy trying to say something he'd been thinking about for a while. "Say it," she said. He looked at the closed file. "Do you ever think about how close it was? How many times in those 30 days it could have gone differently?" He shook his head slowly. If Greer had gone to Whitaker instead, if Jack had been 2 hours later on the road to Cheyenne, if Holloway had been wrong about the ink. "I think about it," she said. And I think about the fact that it didn't go differently." She looked at him. Greer made the choice he made. Jack got there in time. Holloway was right. She paused. "The things that almost went wrong didn't go wrong. And I can spend my energy being afraid of how close it was, or I can spend my energy on the fact that it held." Percy was quiet. "Your father taught you that," he said. "No," she said. "I taught myself that. He taught me the principle. I had to find the application on my own." She looked at the box of letters on the shelf. "That's what I try to tell people when I write back," she said. "Not that it's going to be fine. Not that it's easy. Just that the thing that's worth fighting for, it's worth fighting for. Even if you're afraid. Even if you're alone at the start." She looked at Percy. "Even if the only person who shows up at your gate is a stranger on a tired horse who won't promise you anything except that he'll stand beside you." Percy smiled. "Jack would hate that description." "Jack would say it's accurate," she said. 3 years after the day Eliza walked out of that courthouse with nothing but determination, Monroe Ranch was the most respected working property in Black Hollow County. Not the largest, not the richest, the most respected. It was known as a place that employed people fairly and kept its word and didn't turn anyone away who came to it honestly. It was known as the place that had been the center of the thing that changed the county, and because of that, it carried a gravity that had nothing to do with acreage or cattle contracts. Margaret Tolliver held a community gathering there every spring, which had started as a thank you and become a tradition. 30 or 40 people filling the yard the way they had filled it on that one afternoon in October 3 years ago, but without the crisis underneath it, just neighbors and a meal, and the particular quality of a community that had been through something hard together and come out the other side changed. Jack built a second table for the kitchen that first spring, because the original wasn't big enough anymore for the number of people who ended up sitting around it. He built it from the same wood her father had used for the original, matching the grain as closely as he could, and he put it together on a Sunday morning while Eliza was out checking the cattle, and when she came back and saw it, she stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. "You matched the wood," she said. "Tried to," he said. "Got close." She looked at the 2 tables, old and new, side by side. "He would have approved," she said. "I know," Jack said. "That's why I matched the wood. On the day that Percy brought her the final case closure, the last of the 43, a family in Fremont County, whose water rights had been restored through a settlement that had taken 2.5 years to negotiate. Eliza sat at that doubled table with the paperwork in front of her and read it through twice and signed her name where it needed signing and slid it back to Percy and sat back in her chair. "That's all of them," Percy said. "That's all of them," she agreed. He looked at her across the table. "How does it feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like something that needed to be done is done," she said. "And like the work that comes next is different but not finished." She looked at him. "The laws Percy helped pass, we need to make sure they hold. The trust for the Eastern grazing access needs managing. There are people who still need—" "Eliza," Percy said. She stopped. "Can you just for 1 minute? Can you just feel that it's done?" She looked at him. She looked at the table, at the window, at the yard beyond it where Jack was working, where Will was working, where the ranch that her father had built and she had fought for was going about the ordinary business of being alive. She let herself feel it. All of it. The courthouse and the 30 days, and the night riders, and the letters in the leather case, and the federal courtroom, and the verdict, and the 43 and Clara Marsh's telegraph message, and the Henderson couple sitting at this table, drinking Jack's barely acceptable coffee, and every letter in the box on the shelf above her father's photograph. She let herself feel that it was done. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like something deeper than triumph. Like something that had been wrong in the world was now in this specific corner of it less wrong. Like the thing she had fought for had a shape and a weight that was real, not just legal. Like her father's name was clean. "Okay," she said quietly. "It's done." Percy nodded. They sat together for a moment in the good quiet of something finished. Then Jack came through the back door with mud on his boots and cold air following him in, and he looked at the papers on the table and at Percy's face and at Eliza's, and he understood. "All 43, he said. "All 43, Eliza said. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he said, "I'll make coffee." "Your coffee is still—" "Barely acceptable," he said. "I know, I'm making it anyway." She watched him move to the stove, and she thought about a man on a tired horse at her gate in the evening light, who had told her he wasn't there to save her, and had been exactly right about that, and who had stayed anyway through winter and trial and 43 cases and 2.5 years of the daily particular work of building something that lasted. She thought about her father, who had told her never to let another person decide what she was worth, and who had built a life that proved you could honor that principle every single day, and still leave something behind that mattered. She thought about the woman who had stood in that courtroom and refused to pick up the pen. She looked at everything that refusal had become. Outside the Monroe Ranch, stood on its land in the Wyoming morning solid and present and alive the way Thomas Monroe had built it, and the way Eliza Monroe had fought to keep it, and the way it would stand long after both of them were gone. Not because it was perfect, not because the fight had been easy, not because the world had been fair, but because one woman had understood at the moment when everything was being taken from her that the only thing no one could take was the decision about who she was. She had made that decision in a courthouse with a pen she refused to pick up, and every single thing that followed had come from that one refusal. Her fate had never been someone else's to write. She had always held the pen,